In the intensive care unit, the affluent man regained consciousness, overhearing his wife's phone conversation. Upon discovering the details of the will, he feigned death. James awoke instantly, as if a hidden switch had been triggered, restoring his consciousness. Despite his body's nonresponsiveness, he managed to crack his eyes open slightly, revealing a blindingly white room that made him squint. Where am I, and why does my body feel so weak and powerless? How did I even end up here? He muttered. The answer came in the form of faint squeaks emitted by various sensors and devices a few meters from his bed. Straining his consciousness, James realized he was in a hospital room. However, confusion clouded his thoughts as he pondered how he arrived and what transpired. The glaring overhead light disrupted his focus, while a persistent buzzing in his ears mimicked a ringing alarm. Suddenly, a surge of pain pierced his consciousness, prompting a soft groan to escape his lips. Thirst overwhelmed him, yet there was no water within reach. Despite the unmistakable hospital environment, James questioned the abundance of medical equipment, unfamiliar to him. For drips and sensors adorned his body, rendering him weightless. With limited strength to fully open his eyes, he could only glimpse the world through narrow slits. Sounds appeared distant and muffled, testing his perception. However, a familiar voice, that of his wife Grace, shattered the silence nearby, stirring excitement within him. With the same intonation and a subtle cadence in her speech, Grace's identity became unmistakable. James tensed, attempting to signal her as the door opened. Anticipating anything but this, the businessman braced himself for Dr. Merritt's entrance. "Hello, please update me on my husband's condition. Will he remain in a vegetative state for long, enduring suffering? Perhaps we should consider more drastic measures," Grace inquired, infusing her voice with a pleading tone. A tense silence lingered momentarily before the attending physician responded, advising, "I'll offer you a single piece of counsel: do not provoke fate. Maintain hope for the best, though your husband's chances are slim. However, do not relinquish hope. I also recommend minimizing your time by his side to prevent any inadvertent transmission of infection. Any progress in treatment will be promptly communicated. For now, I strongly suggest you vacate the room." "Of course, you're right. Please forgive me." "I comprehend," Grace replied, her voice syrupy. Shortly after, James heard fading footsteps and the door closing, indicating the doctor's departure, while Grace lingered at his bedside, lost in contemplation. Suddenly, the businessman distinctly recognized the melodious ringtone of a phone in the intensive care unit, its sound so unnatural that it momentarily challenged the reality of the situation. James disdained eavesdropping, deeming it beneath someone of his stature. After all, he was the proprietor of one of the city's finest restaurants. If he were healthy, he would have surely left the room, allowing Grace privacy. However, confined to his bed, he was compelled to listen to the conversation unfold. "Hello, darling, is that you? Your number appears unfamiliar. Did you change it again?" Grace's voice emanated from the phone. "Yes, I've written the will, of course. Where will it go?" "Yes, I've already perused it." Everything's, as the notary's fee was discussed, James's heart raced at his wife's words. Who was Grace speaking so sweetly to? She wasn't merely conversing, she was charming. Could such audacity be possible? And what about this will she mentioned? All doubts dissipated when she added, "Yes, darling, I've just entered the room." "Well, what can I say, my dear? He lies there like a vegetable, no changes. I believe I'll manage the restaurant as I see fit, and when James is no longer with us, then I'll inherit it, as it should be. Well, I must be going, still, there are things to attend to. I love you. Goodbye for now." Such brazenness left James breathless. To discuss her husband's imminent departure in his presence, even labeling him a vegetable, was incomprehensible. Did he deserve such treatment? Meanwhile, lying on the hospital bed, James stubbornly pondered why the sensors, designed to alert the medical staff of his consciousness, hadn't functioned. He recalled seeing a similar scenario in a domestic movie, the title of which eluded him but left its essence etched in his memory. Yet, observing such events from the sidelines was one thing, being directly involved, especially when betrayed by one's spouse, was quite another. James harbored no doubt that betrayal had occurred. But who rescued him from the fiery car crash? Who risked their life for him? As consciousness waned, memories flooded back to the fateful day. The morning of the esteemed restaurant owner, James Williams, unfolded like any other, with him rising at dawn while the city still slumbered. From his house's windows, he admired the awakening city's view, preparing breakfast as he did routinely. He poured himself a glass of orange juice and swiftly cooked eggs with bacon, crafting a simple yet nutritious breakfast. Spending a few minutes on gymnastics to awaken his body, he adhered to a healthy lifestyle without imposing his preferences on others, including his spouse Grace. While he, a vegetarian, abstained from animal products, he refrained from judgment toward meat-eaters, respecting individual choices. Carrying his breakfast tray, he stepped onto the spacious terrace, enclosed for winter with a crackling fireplace in the corner. Enjoying the crisp morning air and tranquility, he contemplated the day's plans, ensuring their successful execution. Grace typically slept during these early hours, leaving James with a slight sense of solitude. After breakfast, he donned his favorite business suit and headed to work, aiming to arrive before opening time to monitor punctuality. Though he disliked tardiness, he refrained from harsh judgment, understanding the challenges faced by employees like Emma, the dishwasher, who relied on unreliable public transport. Snowfall on that fateful day disrupted the city's rhythm, blanketing rooftops in white. Despite his appreciation for such weather, he anticipated weak revenue, knowing residents preferred staying indoors during blizzards. Parking his car, he raised his coat collar, bracing himself for the wintry conditions. As James left the realm of comfort and coziness, a sharp gust of wind greeted him, pelting his face with snow and hastening his pace. The janitor, Henry, was already hard at work with his shovel, rushing to clear the steps before the restaurant owner's arrival. Spotting James, the elderly man raised a welcoming hand. "Good morning, Mr. Williams. The snow's come today, and it'll keep coming. It really makes your bones ache." "Good morning, Henry. Are you still tackling the snow alone?" "I told the security guard to assist you in such moments," James remarked, but the janitor waved it off. "Oh, come on, it's fine. I can manage, James. I'm used to it, you know. It's like exercise for me. A couple of swings with the shovel, and my body feels normal again." The businessman smiled. "Exercise, you say? Well, hand me that shovel. I'll warm up right now and get the blood flowing." The janitor attempted to protest, but James remained steadfast until he took the tool away. In the midst of the blizzard, passers-by looked on with surprise as the respectable businessman skillfully wielded the shovel, clearing the steps of snow. Henry nodded respectfully. "I see you're quite skilled at this, James. Where did you get such extensive practice?" James smiled. "Where else but in the village, of course, at my grandfather's on the distant outskirts. He had quite a lot of fishing there. I'm not much into hunting, you know, but picking mushrooms, berries, or fishing, I'm always up for that. So, there was a lot of snow there in the winter. You'd wake up, and it's dark in the hut, all windows covered in snow. You take a shovel and go ahead." The janitor regarded the restaurant owner with undisguised sympathy. James was a good man, never offending with word or deed, and sometimes even standing up for him, especially in front of the administrator, who enjoyed bullying those weaker than him. "I remember the scoundrel," Henry thought. "And there he is, Mr. Williams, what are you doing? The wind is so strong, and you're thinking of clearing snow. You'll catch a cold for sure. Where would we be without you then?" Andrew shouted over the wind from behind. James turned around, meeting the administrator's eyes, perfectly understanding his deceitful and deliberate flattery. "Oh, come on, Andrew, it's nothing. I'm not a kid, after all. Tell me, how are things at the restaurant? Suppliers didn't let us down, and are all the staff at work?" At the mention of the latter, the administrator grimaced, as if from a toothache dancing on the cold wind. "Yes, everything's in place, except for that dishwasher. What's her name?" "Emma, I think." "No matter how much you scold her, she never comes to work on time," Andrew replied. James looked disapprovingly at the administrator and, handing the shovel to the janitor, said, "Andrew, you very well know." James interjected sharply, "that Emma has 4 children whom, by the way, she raises on her own. And I've asked you not to call her a dishwasher. Emma is a kitchen worker or a kitchen staff member. Learn to respect your subordinates. Without that, you can't build a proper workflow." The boss's remark cut through the air, causing the administrator to shiver and sneakily glance at the janitor, worried that he might have overheard. Ah, he heard it loud and clear. Look at him, grinning from ear to ear. Shameless, Andrew muttered. Well, no matter. We'll sort it out. Let's just get rid of the boss first and then tighten the screws on everyone else. Just then, a stooped figure of a young woman appeared from around the corner, hurrying as fast as possible to get to work, walking straight through the snow. Oh, here comes Emma Fisher. So, what's the excuse this time? Did the bus break down, or did you come up with something more elaborate? The administrator started, but he stopped under James's piercing gaze. Sorry, Mr. Brown. The bus got turned around on the road. Had to find alternatives, Emma replied apologetically, lowering her eyes. All right, off you go. Make sure everything is in order. Clean the dishes thoroughly so they squeak when I touch them, Andrew concluded with a stern look. Emma nodded and hurried towards the entrance door. At that moment, she awkwardly stumbled on a step, causing the sole of her boot to skid on the surface. James was the first to react, supporting Emma at the most dangerous moment. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry for being so clumsy, she began to apologize. Don't apologize, Emma. It's not your fault. But perhaps Andrew should finally get to work and sprinkle some salt on the pathways, James remarked, emphasizing the last word. After that, he took Emma's hand to help her ascend the slippery steps. Despite not wearing gloves, her palm felt very warm to the businessman. Then, something very strange happened. Emma suddenly let out a loud gasp and jerked her tiny hand away. What's wrong? Are you hurt? James asked with concern. Emma guiltily lowered her gaze, clutching her hand into a fist. She looked frightened, not like herself at all. I'm sorry. Please, it's not your fault at all. It must have been my imagination. Sorry again, Emma forced out, fear freezing in her eyes, a fear he could feel in his skin. But what was it about? What did James do wrong? Did he squeeze her hand too hard? No, it didn't seem like it. He shook his head in bewilderment, then hurried after Emma. Catching up with her in the hall, he quietly called out to avoid attracting the attention of others. Emma, what happened? Why did you react so strangely? She froze and looked at him with a strange pity. I'm sorry. It's all because of my visions. What visions? James exclaimed in confusion. Emma paled. Well, the ones that come true, you know, like premonitions, but real. They started back in school when I got a concussion during a PE class. We were climbing a rope, and I fell. The height wasn't much, but that's when it all began, the businessman James frowned. And what, may I ask, did you see in these visions? Tears suddenly filled Emma's eyes. It's a car accident. What color is your car? Dark green, James replied. When I touched your hand, I immediately understood that car will be involved in a terrible accident. But it won't be your fault, it will be someone very close to you. I saw it the moment I touched your hand. It struck me like lightning, Emma explained. James looked at his colleague with irony. He didn't believe in any prophecies, in his understanding, it was sheer nonsense. All these fortune-tellers and seers were just charlatans. He remembered Madame's prediction of a long and thorny path to success back in his student years. And so what? The path did await, of course, but it required a great deal of hard work, and those predictions had nothing to do with it. Emma looked at her boss with concern, realizing he didn't believe a word she said. Excuse me, Mr. Williams, but I heard you refrain from driving for the near future. She said. He just smiled. Oh, don't worry, Emma. I've been driving for over 10 years, and I've had no issues with it. Besides, I never exceed the speed limit, so there's no need for unnecessary concern. All right, an accident is definitely not in my cards, James reassured her. Emma nodded in agreement, looking at James as if he were already doomed. All right, then. Get back to work and don't dwell on the negatives. By the way, how are your little ones? If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I'll help however I can, said James as he headed to his office. Thank you, everything's fine, Mr. Williams. I just need your permission for something, Emma cautiously asked. Permission? Of course, go ahead. What do you need? James replied. The dishwasher hesitated for a moment as if gathering her strength, then said, I want to ask for your permission to take home the dishes that customers rejected. Just one or two. I'll pay for everything, don't worry. Can it be deducted from my salary? James smiled. Yes, of course. What's the matter, and no payment is necessary. They're going to be disposed of anyway. Besides, it seems both you and the kids will benefit. And take as many as you want, it's just leftovers. Joyful sparks danced in her eyes, this was real luck. Meanwhile, James went about his usual business, talking on the phone with the restaurant manager, approving menus, and preparing for the inspection, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Yet from time to time, he remembered Emma's words, which had struck a chord with him. Can you believe it? A kitchen worker with fortune-telling abilities. That's a first for me. But soon, thoughts of a possible road accident faded away, making room for meetings with new suppliers, tasting new dishes, and discussing current restaurant matters with the administrator. Maintaining an atmosphere of trust and cooperation, James gently resolved disputes, using the stick far less often than the carrot. Time passed unnoticed, crossing the 3-hour mark, the fury of the storm still raged, but its morning impact had diminished. The city's utilities surprisingly quickly took control of the situation and cleared most of the vital roads. Although there was still an hour and a half left in the workday, James decided to leave early today. An interesting plan had matured in his mind regarding how he could fill this February evening with an aura of love and romance. James decided to pamper his spouse with a gorgeous bouquet of roses, a bottle of wine, and something delicious from his own restaurant kitchen. While the last two items didn't take him much time, searching for flowers in the snow-covered city turned it into a real quest. To James's immense dismay, most of the pavilions were closed, likely because the stall owners assumed there would be hardly anyone interested in buying flowers on such a day. Just when James was almost losing hope, he noticed that one of the shops at the street corner was still open. With a joyous heart, James parked his car by the roadside and stepped inside. The pavilion smelled pleasantly of roses, tulips, and freshly imported mimosa, fitting for the end of February with just under 2 weeks left until the beloved Women's Day. The salesperson turned out to be a rather nice girl who quickly helped James put together the bouquet he needed. Understandably so, the businessman's heart was singing, eagerly anticipating the romantic evening ahead with his beloved awaiting his return. Grace didn't usually prepare dinner for him, knowing he could satisfy his hunger at a restaurant, so James took fruit and vegetable platters, champagne, and a couple of delicious dishes from Chef Frank, which he prepared just heavenly. Arriving home, James didn't bother ringing the doorbell, he decided to open it with his own key. Stepping into the hallway, James heard subdued music coming from the bedroom. Grace must be watching her series again, he thought as he walked into the kitchen with the bags in his hands. Thoughtfully, he left the bouquet in the living room to give it to her a little later. With a joyful expression on his face, James entered the bedroom, and the hand with the bouquet involuntarily dropped, causing one of the roses to lose a couple of its petals. Grace wasn't in the bedroom, apparently, she had left, leaving the TV on. But where did she go, especially in such a snowstorm? What if something happened to her? She's not confident behind the wheel, that's a fact. Of course, the car. I need to see if it's in the garage or not, a frantic thought flashed through his mind. Just as he was leaving the bedroom, James heard an urgent broadcast of local news about a foreign car falling off the city bridge half an hour ago, driven by an inexperienced girl. His heart raced faster. My God, it's Grace, of course, who else? I even transferred money to her card to buy a new dress, that's why she decided to buy it. Getting into the car, James rushed off like a man possessed, speeding towards the bridge. A couple of times, the car slid on the turn, but James managed to control it. His experience and knowledge of his iron horse's capabilities paid off. But Grace, she's only recently started driving. And why did he even make her this gift? There were just under 2 miles left to the bridge when James's car slid again. He slammed the brake pedal to the floor, but there was no effect. For some inexplicable reason, the brakes failed, putting James in a life-threatening dilemma. Swerve the wheel and go into the ditch, or crash head-on into the small car parked on the roadside. Of course, he chose the first option, and after rolling several times in the distorted car, crashed into a tree. The last thing he remembered was the sharp smell of gasoline from the damaged fuel tank, needing just one single spark to ignite it. And now, he lies in a hospital room, hearing the persistent beeping of life support machines and pondering what happened. Of course, James has already guessed that he made a fatal mistake that evening, and the girl who fell from the bridge into the river was not Grace at all. But when events unfold so swiftly, reason can no longer help. Only now did he realize that his wife had been meeting with her lover all this time, whom she valued above all else in the world. And then there was the will, right? How could he forget about it? Grace herself had persuaded him to draw it up a couple of months ago. Back then, James didn't find it strange, but in light of recent events, it took on a completely different, alarming shade. The thought of such blatant betrayal by his wife stirred his consciousness, not allowing him to relax and accept the situation as it was. Deciding to pretend to be in a coma, James tightly shut his eyes so that Grace wouldn't notice any signs of life in him. He could feel his wife's piercing, hateful gaze, her hands itching to press a few buttons and disconnect him from life support machines. The temptation to do so was so great that Grace's hands literally trembled, and her lips merged into a single straight line. The most hurtful thing for him was that he couldn't prevent his wife from carrying out her plan. The danger was so close that he felt death's breath around his neck again. Fortunately, the sound of high heels clicking on the concrete floor echoed in the corridor, causing Grace to hurriedly retreat, and a minute later, the familiar voice of the attending doctor could be heard in the ward. "Oh, it happens. It's just mind-boggling. She's ready to bury him alive, you know. And why marry such vipers?" Dr. Merritt's conversation partner paused for a moment, then replied, "What's so surprising about it? They say this patient owns an elite restaurant in the city, and he has also made a will." From the tone of the speaker, James immediately understood that she was a nurse. At that moment, Dr. Merritt approached James's bed almost closely and remarked aloud, "Strange, some sensors are somehow disabled, Erica. Probably some malfunction. We need to call a specialist, let him see what's what. However, it takes time for a patient to come out of a coma. I'm sure he'll survive against all odds and prove that a miracle in such a case is quite possible." Erica nodded and, following the departing doctor with her eyes, began to deal with the capricious sensors. But before she could turn one of them on, James whispered quietly, "Water, give me water." The nurse was startled by the unexpectedness of it, almost jumping in place. "So, you've woken up. Why didn't you signal?" James gathered his remaining strength and whispered, "Please don't tell anyone that I've regained consciousness. Of course, we won't be able to deceive the attending physician, but let it be a secret, at least for today." Erica pondered. The patient's request sounded very strange, although considering his wife's behavior, it didn't seem out of the ordinary to her anymore, especially since James asked her to keep the secret just now. "All right, I'll do everything. But you still can't drink, the most I can do is moisten your lips," Erica whispered to the patient. James tiredly closed his eyes, realizing that the nurse was right, and 5 minutes later, a wet piece of cotton soaked in water touched his lips, containing the much-needed moisture. Trying to quench his thirst even a little, James gently parted his lips to squeeze the cotton tip full of precious liquid. Naturally, it was too little, but James didn't insist. The main thing was that he stayed alive and didn't burn alive in the flaming car. While James pondered this issue, Erica set up an IV drip to provide his body with nutrients. Tears of gratitude glistened in James's eyes as he saw how caring she was and how she tried to help, despite everything. Mrs. Williams, if I may suggest, for added effect, you should consider utilizing hidden surveillance cameras. Grace looked at Andrew with surprise, clearly fond of him. "And are there such cameras here?" The administrator smiled contentedly. "Of course, how else?" True, Mr. Williams didn't like to watch the videos and only resorted to them in cases of extreme necessity. More often than not, the cameras are simply turned off, but after the boss had the accident, I keep them on. It's immediately evident when someone is in their element, unlike the lax management of my dear husband. But such tricks won't fly with me. Well done, Andrew, your idea with the cameras is simply invaluable. Grace exclaimed, eliciting a satisfied smile from the administrator. A few minutes later, Grace started the recording and leaned in to monitor every move of the staff. At first, she couldn't spot anything interesting. Waitresses bustled around the hall, the head chef commanded in the kitchen, and the waiter greeted clients at the entrance. Everything was as usual until Grace noticed yesterday's recording of a young dishwasher with a bulky bag in her hands. Look at her, so clever. What could she possibly carry in such a bag? Probably empties the fridge before leaving and takes it all home. And all this right under the nose of my foolish husband. Upon closer inspection of Emma, Grace decided to catch her in the act, not wanting to miss the opportunity to exert her authority. With a plan forming in her mind, Grace waited for the perfect moment to confront Emma, eager to show her dominance and assert her control over the restaurant staff. Meanwhile, James, still in his coma, remained unaware of the power struggle unfolding in his absence, his mind consumed by dreams of recovery and defiance against his deceitful wife. As the tension between Grace and the employees escalated, the fate of the restaurant hung in the balance, caught between the manipulative machinations of its new manager and the silent determination of its unconscious owner, Emma with the bulky bag. Grace's heart raced with anticipation. This was her chance to catch the young dishwasher in the act and assert her authority. With a determined expression, Grace followed Emma discreetly, making sure not to raise any suspicion. As Emma approached the exit, Grace quickened her pace, ready to confront her. Just as Emma reached for the door handle, Grace stepped forward, blocking her path. "Emma," Grace said sternly, her voice laced with authority. "What do you think you're doing with that bag?" Emma's eyes widened in surprise and fear as she turned to face Grace. "Oh, Mrs. Williams," she stammered nervously. I was just..." "Save your excuses," Grace interrupted, her tone cutting. "I saw you with that bag. Don't think you can fool me. What are you planning to do with all that food?" Emma's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she struggled to find an explanation. I was just going to take it home," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have a family to feed, and..." "Save your sob stories," Grace snapped, her patience wearing thin. "You know perfectly well that's against company policy. And you have the audacity to do it right under my nose." Grace's words hung heavily in the air as Emma hung her head in shame, realizing the gravity of her actions. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to." But Grace was not interested in apologies. "Sorry won't cut it," she declared coldly. "You've crossed a line, Emma. Consider this your final warning. One more slip-up, and you're out of here." With that, Grace turned on her heel and marched back into the restaurant, leaving Emma standing there, feeling utterly defeated. As she watched Grace disappear into the building, Emma couldn't help but wonder how her life had taken such a wrong turn. And little did she know, this confrontation was just the beginning of her troubles as Grace tightened her grip on the restaurant, determined to assert her dominance at any cost. "Deal with it yourself," Grace snapped bitterly. "She only has 2 of her own and 2 more from her husband's first marriage," the administrator added obligingly. "They're all mine, and as for what my husband left, let it remain on his conscience. He's in prison now, caught stealing. He thought the kids would help him reduce his sentence, but I managed to get his rights." Rever Ed, Emma muttered through tears, but Grace remained unmoved. Honestly, what Grace needed right now was a scapegoat to show her power to everyone else. Emma, who had the misfortune of being caught in the crossfire, became just that. "So how about you, Fisher? Right, well, you're fired. You can go wherever you want," Grace concluded, gesturing towards the door. Despair froze in Emma's eyes. But how could this be? Could she really be dismissed like some unwanted stray dog? The administrator in turn didn't want to stay on the sidelines and contributed his 2 cents to the matter. "Oh, and I almost forgot, Fisher, don't count on your salary. You understand, the money will go towards compensating the damages." The news was a devastating blow to Emma, realizing that she had been deceived by everyone who could. She went outside and exposed her heated cheeks to the freezing wind. Seeing this, Henry couldn't help himself and approached her. "Dear, don't cry, don't torment yourself, sunshine. You know Andrew is in favor right now. That's why he's doing whatever he pleases, and when Mr. Williams recovers, his reign will come to an end. And so that you don't end up completely without money, I'll allocate some for my pension for you. You can repay it whenever you can." "No rush," said the janitor, embracing the fragile woman by the shoulders. "Thank you, Henry, for your support and protection. You see, I was counting so much on this money, and then this happened. We're struggling with the kids in a rented apartment, and the landlady keeps raising the rent, saying you receive child benefits so you won't become poor." Emma replied, choking back tears. The elderly man shook his head. He felt sorry for Emma, to say the least. "Such a good colleague, calm, diligent. Deal with it yourself," Grace snapped bitterly. "She only has 2 of her own and 2 more from her husband's first marriage," the administrator added obligingly. "They're all mine, and as for what my husband left, let it remain on his conscience. He's in prison now, caught stealing. He thought the kids would help him reduce his sentence, but I managed to get his rights revoked, Grace said, unmoved by Emma's tears. Honestly, what Grace needed right now was a scapegoat to show her power to everyone else, and Emma, caught in the crossfire, became just that. So how about you, Fisher? Right, well, you're fired. You can go wherever you want, Grace concluded, gesturing towards the door. Despair froze in Emma's eyes. Could this really be happening? Could she really be dismissed like some unwanted stray dog? The administrator didn't want to stay on the sidelines and added his 2 cents. Oh, and I almost forgot, Fisher. Don't count on your salary. The money will go towards compensating the damages. The news was devastating to Emma, realizing she had been deceived by everyone. She went outside and exposed her heated cheeks to the freezing wind. Seeing this, Henry couldn't help himself and approached her. Shoo, dear, don't cry. Don't torment yourself, sunshine. You know Andrew is in favor right now, which is why he's doing whatever he pleases. When Mr. Williams recovers, his reign will end. And so you don't end up completely without money, I'll allocate some from my pension for you. You can repay it whenever you can, no rush, said the janitor, embracing the fragile woman by the shoulders. Thank you, Henry, for your support and protection. I was counting so much on this money, and now this happened. We're struggling with the kids in a rented apartment, and the landlady keeps raising the rent, saying I receive child benefits so I won't become poor, Emma replied, choking back tears. The elderly man shook his head. He felt sorry for Emma, to say the least. Such a good colleague, calm, diligent, never speaks ill of anyone. She washes dishes up to her elbows in hot water, and that's it. This Andrew, the administrator, is a first-rate troublemaker. Henry remembered him from his work at the high school, where he had been a craft teacher for over 40 years. When Andrew was a student, he behaved extremely insolently, humiliating those poorer or physically weaker than him. Henry once tried to shame Andrew, but it was all in vain. One dark night, the workshops for practicing crafts caught fire. Many blamed Henry, saying he didn't put out his cigarette properly, but he had never smoked and always observed fire safety precautions. The mystery was unraveled with Andrew, who had committed arson with a group of teenage friends. Mitra couldn't prove anything at the time and was subsequently fired from the school with a corresponding note in his employment record. Overall, the dismissal didn't bother the crafts teacher too much, as he was formerly retired by then and had no bread left on his plate for sure. After 17 years had passed since the incident, by a twist of fate, Andrew and the elderly janitor crossed paths again, though in quite different capacities. Now, of course, Andrew pretended not to recognize his former teacher, but Henry Brooks was no fool and had seen far too much in life to take Andrew at his word. However, James appealed to him, honest, kind, fair, just the kind of leader he should be. Clutching the money given by Henry, Emma slowly made her way towards the bus stop to catch her needed bus on time. Memories of the recent snowstorm loomed on both sides of the road, with dirty gray mounds of snow that had fallen several weeks ago. Lost in her somber thoughts, Emma trudged along the street when suddenly she heard a muffled murmuring. It turned out that she hadn't managed to distance herself from the restaurant by a decent margin, so she quickly turned around, thinking Henry was following her to say something, but there was no one behind her. A fairly brisk frost lingered, nipping at her nose and rosy cheeks. The mysterious sound repeated, and Emma realized it was coming from the nearest snowdrift. Understanding that someone clearly needed help, she cautiously approached and froze in shock. There lay a man with a bloody head, groaning softly and unconscious on the dirty gray snow. Emma's first thought was that the stranger had simply had too much to drink and had fallen, hitting his head, but when she leaned over the young man, she immediately realized he was as sober as a judge. Without a second thought, Emma lifted the unfortunate man under his armpits and tried to get him on his feet. He was gradually regaining consciousness, indicating that the initial shock from the injury was wearing off. Damn, how could this happen? Bastards, don't touch Jack, the man muttered deliriously. Meanwhile, Emma, stooped under the weight of the stranger's body, led him to Henry's shed. Thinking that the injured man was simply delirious, she tried to ignore his muttering and persevered towards their destination. The man she had rescued was definitely a vagabond and could have frozen to death on the streets in such bitter cold. Seeing the flushed Emma, Henry understood everything without words. Taking the man from the other side, he, with Emma's help, quickly laid him on the cot, which had once been a folding sofa. Well, that's better. Now let's treat the wound on his head. He'll probably recover soon, Henry sighed in relief, taking out bandages, cotton, and antiseptic from the first aid kit. Can you manage? Shouldn't we call an ambulance? Emma asked anxiously, but the janitor just shook his head. No, dear, there's no need. Why distract people from more important work? I wanted to be a doctor in my youth, but I failed the entrance exams. Then I spent a year and a half in medical school and decided to become a nurse, but even there, luck wasn't on my side, so I had to become a laborer, Emma. But I know how to provide first aid, so don't worry. The lad is tough, street smart, he'll pull through, no doubt. Emma's face immediately lit up with a sweet smile as the wounded man opened his eyes and began to turn his head from side to side, trying to understand where he found himself. Easy there, buddy, easy. Sudden movements aren't recommended for you right now. Just lie down and regain your senses. Do you at least remember your name? Henry cautiously asked. The guy forced a smile. Of course I do. Connor, that's my name. Sawyer, the last name. Got beaten up because of a dog. These rich kids wanted some fun with a victim, and they chose the dog, Jack. He's a street dog, you know, settled near the meat pavilion, not afraid of people. So when I saw that villainy, I immediately rushed to help. I took down 2 on the snow, but the third one, the jerk, hit me on the head with something. Henry nodded sympathetically. Yeah, that kind of thing happens. Don't worry, stay here as long as you need. I have firewood and a little stove here, you'll be as comfortable as can be. Connor gratefully looked at Emma, who didn't pass by and helped him in his difficult moment. Sneaking a glance at her watch, she sighed sadly. Well, looks like I'll have to take a taxi now. There go my savings. I've already missed the bus. Connor sniffled with a guilty look and turned away to the wall, feeling it was because of him. The vagabond said, Forgive me, for God's sake. I didn't mean for it to turn out this way. I've been having quite the adventures lately. 3 weeks ago, I pulled a rich guy out of a burning car. Maybe you heard about it, it was quite a loud incident. Emma paled and involuntarily looked at her palm, remembering what happened to her during the revelation regarding Mr. Williams' future. We heard, Connor. That was the restaurant owner, you know, the one Emma and I used to work for, Henry replied for both of them. We don't work there anymore, at least I don't, Emma corrected him immediately. The guy shook his head sadly and winced from the pain, his neck was stiff, and any slightly sharp movement caused a spasm. Easy, my friend, Henry said gently. Don't get agitated, and for saving our friend here, you deserve a special thank you, Henry said to James. James was a very good person and probably still is, the janitor corrected himself. I just happened to be there, it's not really my territory. You see, us vagabonds, we divide everything by districts, by yards. Step onto someone else's turf, and you'll quickly get your ribs cracked so you won't want to come back. But there, I saw it, an accident and a pillar of smoke rising from it. People were running around wailing, but no one was rushing to save the men. The gas tank could have exploded at any moment, the vagabond began his story. Henry looked at his interlocutor with undisguised respect. Deep down, he had long concluded that Connor was a good man, otherwise, would he have rushed to the defense of a stray dog? Unlikely. Connor took a deep breath and, touching the wound on his temple with his fingers, continued, As soon as I saw that someone could burn alive, I ran straight to the car. I smashed the glass with a cobblestone and started pulling him out of the car. All around there was noise, chaos, people shouting that the fuel tank would soon explode. It was all true, but you can't just leave the driver. Anyway, I made it, dragged him about 10 meters away, and then it went off. You, my friend, are a true hero to just throw yourself into the fire for our James, Henry said sorrowfully. Emma looked warmly at the rescued boy and caught herself thinking that all this seemed somehow not accidental. Connor saved James, and she saved Connor. After that, it was hard to believe in coincidences. Since Emma couldn't delay any longer, she called a taxi and went home, where 4 hungry children were waiting for her, Nathan, Anna, Peter, and Emily. At the same time, James lay in a hospital bed, gradually coming to his senses. Of course, he still had little strength and could barely hold a spoon and fork on his own. Erica and Dr. Merritt kept their word and skillfully fooled Grace for about 5 days, who had decided to disconnect her husband from life support machines and claim her rightful inheritance. On the 5th day, James called Erica over and asked for help with another scheme. "I need to leave for a short while, you understand." The nurse looked at him incredulously, wondering if he was joking. Less than a week ago, he had come out of a coma, and now he was planning an escape. "No, James, excuse me, but I won't take such responsibility. What if something happens to you? What should I do then, stand trial?" Erica objected. Desperation froze in James's eyes. "Well, help me. Be a human. Will you? I'll sign any document you want, acknowledging the consequences and relieving the clinic of all responsibility," James pleaded. Erica shook her head negatively, although she understood deep down that she couldn't refuse the patient. Grace had been too unpleasant to her, rushing to get rid of her husband, not hesitating in her choice of means and accomplices. "Fine, I agree, but only if we go together, okay? It'll be calmer for both of us." Just in the evening, a couple of hours before lights out, the nurse suggested and immediately received an affirmative answer. Truth be told, James found it much more convenient himself, since he still didn't walk as confidently as before and could lose his balance at any moment. "Okay, Erica, but let's keep this between us. Not even Dr. Merritt should know, so that no one knows anything," the businessman pleaded, looking into her eyes hopefully. Erica nodded and began to prepare everything necessary for the breakout, taking with her medicines for emergencies and borrowing a walking stick from one of the clinic's patients. Meanwhile, James lay on the bed, gathering strength for the plan he had been considering for several days. Remembering Emma in his thoughts, the businessman couldn't hold back his tears. God, she was right all along. She spelled it out so clearly, and I, the fool, didn't believe her. Now I'm paying for my carelessness. Yes, Grace is also quite something. She got herself a lover and set her sights on my assets. Well, I'll settle the score with her, that's for sure, although not with the same barbaric method she employs, the businessman thought with despair, closing his eyes and pretending to be a man who had fallen into a coma. Time stretched like rubber, and when Erica finally appeared in the ward with a set of clean clothes, James realized there was no turning back. "Here, get dressed. These are my ex-husband's things. We've been divorced for a long time, but he never bothered to take them. I think they'll fit you," Erica explained with a smile. James changed as quickly as he could, staggering under the weight of exhaustion, and followed the nurse. The injuries from the accident were definitely taking their toll, forcing James to stop every 300 feet to catch his breath. It's worth mentioning Erica's understanding of his weakness. She did her best to support him, minimizing his time spent outside. Additionally, she hired a private driver who didn't rush and didn't ask unnecessary questions when faced with a weary client with a wooden stick in his hands. Arriving at his home, James felt overwhelming anxiety, the drumbeat pounding in his ears. Erica looked at him with concern, but it was too late to turn back now. James was simply obligated to finish what he had started. Only then would their efforts be worth it. And gave her a life of luxury, but now it was time to reclaim what was his and ensure she faced the consequences of her actions. Stepping out of the car, James shivered in the cold wind and approached the door. He had his keys, which had been with him along with his wallet and smartphone at the time of the accident. Inserting the key into the lock, James tried to turn it, realizing it clearly didn't fit. Did Grace change them? She adapted to the new reality quickly, I must say, James whispered, putting the useless key back in his pocket and pressing the doorbell. Instantly, a cheerful trill of a familiar melody filled the air. Erica stood a little aside, patiently awaiting the outcome. Soon, footsteps echoed from the depths of the house, and the door swung open, revealing the sturdy figure of James's wife's lover in James's own bathrobe. This bathrobe had been a birthday gift from James's late mother, and this jerk wore it without a shred of conscience. Stunned by such audacity, the businessman froze in place, challenging the lover with his gaze. "Who's there, darling? Not the utilities again, I hope. But I've paid everything in advance for a month so we could relax at the resort." Grace's languid voice came from behind the stranger. James paled and clenched his fists painfully. Grace understood everything instantly and, without being embarrassed by the presence of her lover, dropped to her knees. "James, please forgive me. It's not what you think. I swear, I thought you had only a few days left." The doctor didn't make any prognosis, and miracles don't happen, or do they, darling? James ground his teeth and uttered through gritted teeth, I'll give you 5 minutes to gather your things and leave this house. Grace's lover straightened his powerful shoulders and looked mockingly at the homeowner. Listen, unfinished businessman, go get yourself treated and don't interfere with normal people's lives. It's a pity you didn't crash back then. James clenched the handle of his cane so tightly that his fingers turned white. You won't have to wait, you bastard. You thought you buried me alive, but I survived against all odds. I'm sure that the accident was staged. I'll make sure to uncover the truth. At the mention of this, the bully immediately wilted and sadly wandered deeper into the house to change. The fairy tale of a rainbow relationship with Grace ended as abruptly as it began, and now it was time for payback for everything that had happened. Of course, James couldn't prove Grace's involvement in the accident, but instead, he deprived her of the means of existence and blocked all her cards and accounts. Once upon a time, James had pulled Grace out of provincial obscurity and gave her a life of luxury, but now it was time to reclaim what was his and ensure she faced the consequences of her actions. James had done everything to make Grace feel like a businesswoman, but after such betrayal, he couldn't forgive the traitor. Long ago, he had saved Grace from criminal prosecution for fraud she allegedly didn't commit. In reality, she was a hardcore criminal who only cared about enriching herself. Now, due to new circumstances, James called the investigator again and said that his ex-wife's case should be reopened and reinvestigated. Upon hearing this, Grace grabbed a heavy vase to hit her husband on the head, but Erica was vigilant and intercepted the fraudster's hand in time. At the same time, several police cars pulled up to the house, and officers in plain clothes, armed to the teeth, stepped out. For Grace and her lover, it was all over. James, on the other hand, looked at his handcuffed ex-wife with a sad gaze and collapsed from exhaustion. Perhaps if Erica hadn't been there, he would have fallen into a coma again. But instead, he gently sank to the ground, supported by the caring hands of the young nurse. James didn't hear the wail of the ambulance anymore and woke up only the next morning, startled by the muffled voices. But this time, it wasn't his wife discussing his will with her lover. It was his loyal and trustworthy friends, the janitor Henry, the dishwasher Emma, and the homeless guy Connor. Upon closer inspection, the businessman immediately recognized the street hero who had pulled him out of the burning car. Wishing to remain anonymous, Connor had decided to disappear out of fear of excessive attention. As he listened to Connor, James found himself thinking that he definitely wanted to see him as the manager of his restaurant, a sentiment shared by Emma, who had earned a promotion to waitress or even assistant chef through her diligent hard work. However, she could choose whatever role she needed. In any case, James was ready to fulfill any of their wishes. But first, he wanted to publicly confess his feelings to Erica, which had ignited in his heart during all the recent trials. Tears glistened in the nurse's eyes, and her response elicited a storm of applause from everyone present. Yes, I agree, but please, in the future, stay away from hospitals, she said. Connor smiled and, subtly winking at Emma, hinted very unmistakably that he was in solidarity with the young businessman and ready to become the father of her 4 children, or perhaps even 5. Who knows? If there was mutual respect and love, everything else would fall into place: weddings, pregnancies, and the joyful laughter of children.